Let's read chapter 5, verse 1. It says, Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. And while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. And the same hour the fingers of a handsman appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. All right, you guys can be seated. Last couple of weeks we covered chapter 4, and it was the last time that we saw King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has been on the scene. He's been the king for a while. The transition between chapter 4 and chapter 5 is pretty large time-wise. It's about a 70-year difference. Or it's been 70 years since the capture of Jerusalem, but time-wise between chapter 4 and chapter 5 has been many years. Nebuchadnezzar at this point is no longer the king. He is dead. Now his, I would say, grandson is now the king. Okay? In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar had another dream where God spoke to him in a vision. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest king to ever live, and greatest in the definition of like the most powerful, most authority. And we're going to see that fact when Daniel comes onto the scene in chapter 5 and speaks to Belteshazzar and tells him, hey, look, this is who your grandfather was. If he wanted someone dead, they could be dead. If he wanted someone alive, they would stay alive. Like, he had that much power and authority that no man has ever had. And what we come to find out in chapter 4, where he got this glory, where he got this power, where he got this authority, was from God alone. Right? Chapter 4 was pretty evident of that. Like, and Nebuchadnezzar had to come to an understanding of that. And the only way that he could fully come to that understanding was to be brought so low that he became a beast of the field for 7 years, to the point where he finally realized in verse 26, he says, after you come to know that heaven rules. Right? This was the whole point of him being brought so low in humiliation, the destruction that came from pride, so that he understood that heaven rules. Not him, not his kingdom, not his power, not his majesty, because it means nothing to God. And again, ultimately, God allowed it, because remember, look, turn back to chapter 1, because we're going to see this come into play in chapter 5, what we just read. It says in verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. This is the fall of Jerusalem, right? 70 years prior. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into whose hand? Nebuchadnezzar's, with some of the articles of the house of God, which then Nebuchadnezzar carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasures of his God. So this is like, he conquered it, right? This is what he has earned. It's his spoil, and he has brought it into the houses of his gods, which we come to find out mean nothing, because remember, he calls upon all the wise men of the land, and none of them can interpret, nor can none of them tell what the contents of his dream is, his first dream. And so we find out that there are no gods except for the one true living God who brought revelation through Daniel. And I think for a moment, Nebuchadnezzar recognized that. Like, he recognized that in his mind, but never fully surrendered to it and submitted to it. Because then he boasts again, he becomes prideful again, he becomes arrogant. He makes then this great splendor of himself and of an image that everyone has to bow down and worship. And then Daniel's 3 buddies don't worship it. Remember this? And they get thrown into the fire and they don't get burnt. And Nebuchadnezzar's like, whoa, this must surely be the living God, right? And for an instance, you think, okay, this guy, he gets it. He's a believer. Like, he's a Christian. But no, then we come to find out that the fruits don't reveal that, because he starts to walk about, again, in his pride. And that's the last thing that we as Christians should, exemplify. Doesn't mean that we can't struggle with it, but it shouldn't be prominent within our lives. It shouldn't be the main fruit that comes from our lives. So we see that happening with Nebuchadnezzar, and then he has another dream, the second dream, and Daniel comes to interpret again. And Daniel then feels bad to interpret this dream because he's come to, love his master and care for him. Daniel's a good servant, right? And he has the heart of God, unlike Jonah. Remember, Jonah's like, God, I'm not going to Nineveh. I hate those people. And I know if I go to share the gospel with them that you won't relent in giving your grace to them because I know your character. You don't hold on to that stuff. You will forgive those who repent. This is the very reason he didn't want to go. And what ends up happening? Well, the whole city, the greatest city on earth at that point, repents. So we see two different hearts here. Daniel had the heart for a wicked pagan king. He loved him, he cared for him. So he didn't want to tell him the interpretation, but he does. And he warns him. And he gives him advice and saying, you should walk away from your sin. You should repent. And a whole year goes by. And remember what happens? He's walking on the top of his kingdom, and he looks out and he sees his kingdom and he sees all of his glory. He's like, look at what I have built. And at that very moment, he's struck down into a beast of the field for 7 years. Until he comes, in verse 34, at the end of the time, it says, Nebuchadnezzar lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. And then he goes on praising him. Right? He comes to his understanding. It returns to him. And I think at that point, there's a difference between knowing God, because we can come here and know these things. Right? You can even, in essence, believe that there's a God. But remember what James says. It says even the demons know and believe in Jesus. But they don't surrender and submit to him. Right? There's a difference of like knowing in your mind and then a knowing of trust, of faith, where I will completely surrender, like where you become my king. Or like Paul says best, Paul, the bondservant of Christ, right? I choose to submit myself to you as you the master and me the slave. That's how much I trust you and believe in you, and my faith is placed in you. And I think that's what's finally happened for Nebuchadnezzar here. But this faith is not something that is passed down genetically. It's not passed down, because your parents come to church and they're saved. It doesn't mean that you're automatically saved. I've heard it said once, and I thought it was a great quote, that God has no grandchildren, right? Just because your parents may be a child of God because they're born again, doesn't mean that you automatically are because you happen to be their child, right? God has no grandchildren. He only has sons and daughters. Those, like I said on Sunday, those who are born again and adopted into the family of God because of what Jesus Christ has done. So, Nebuchadnezzar's son, that faith doesn't pass down to him automatically. And the same thing to his grandson here, Belshazzar. Sorry, I said Belteshazzar earlier. That's Daniel. So don't mix that up. What was Daniel's Babylonian name? Belteshazzar. What's this king's name? Belshazzar. There's a difference. You see the T in there? Right? Daniel's Belteshazzar, and this king is Belshazzar. So they're two different people. This is not Daniel here in chapter 5 where it says Belshazzar. This is a new king. This is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He's gone. He had a son. His name was Nabonidus, and he married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, who was a widow of the previous king, and she bore him a son by the name of Belshazzar, who we see here in chapter 5. And so again, the time that has elapsed from the capture of Jerusalem is about 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, and he reigned for 43 years. And if you remember, based on the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, the very first one of the statue, remember it was made of 4 different materials from top to bottom. Do you remember what those 4 different materials were? The first one was, the head was gold. What was the next part? The arms and silver. And then the torso, was it the torso? Was bronze. And the legs, iron. And the feet, iron mixed with clay. Good job, guys. Very good. I should have had like a visual, because I'm a visual learner. So you have those 4 different elements. And remember, the feet are kind of mixed in with the legs. So we'll call that the iron, right? So really 4 different elements, which signified 4 different kingdoms. The very top one, the gold, was which kingdom? Babylon, right? We know that because Daniel said it, right? He told Nebuchadnezzar, this is you. You're the head, you're the gold, right? And we're like, whoa, Nebuchadnezzar, you're amazing, right? That's what he's thinking in his head. And he was, because remember, the Bible calls him the King of Kings, lowercase king of lowercase kings. He's the best king that ever lived. Again, best in the definition of like, not like, hey, this is a good king. No, but like authority and power, right? So he reigns for 43 years, but it's not the longest reign of the kingdoms within that statue, right? Within that dream. Because then what kingdom, what empire then overthrows Babylon and signifies the silver aspect of that statue? Medo-Persia, right? Then, after Medo-Persia, you've got a 3rd kingdom, which is Greece. Then you've got the 4th kingdom, which is Rome. Good job. So what we're going to see here in chapter 5, which we're not going to get to tonight, and we didn't read the entirety of the chapter, we will see that transition from the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which we are currently seeing right now with Nebuchadnezzar, and now his grandson Belshazzar, is now going to transfer to the Persians. And you see this at the end of chapter 5 with King Darius. But we'll get there in about a week or 2. So for 43 years he reigns. And it's not the longest, even though he was the greatest. It's not the longest. So the greatest doesn't signify how big of a territory you have or how long your empire reigned, but it was a matter of how much power and authority that king or that kingdom had. And Nebuchadnezzar had the most of anyone. As we're going to read in a week or 2, that Daniel describes Nebuchadnezzar's reign and the power and authority they had in a way where if he wanted someone to die, he could just say, he's dead. And that's it. Nobody could overrule that. Nobody, you didn't need 2 keys to unlock one thing. He had all the keys, right? There was no accountability. There was no stopping it. His word was the finality. So 43 years he reigns, then he dies. Then several of Nebuchadnezzar's sons, they tried to fight and assassinate their way to the throne until 556 BC, when then one of the sons-in-law, which we talked about earlier, Nabonidus, took the throne and he ruled for 17 years. And he was not a good king either. Okay? He didn't like to stay at home. He went out in the battlefields. He liked to build pagan temples. And while he was away, he ended up appointing his son, Belshazzar here, co-regent, to rule with the equal authority from Babylon. And now at this point in chapter 5, it's about 539 BC. And the Persian Empire is on the way. They have already been making progress in overtaking Babylon to the point where this is the end. This is the last night. Because in this night, we're going to see the overtaking of Babylon. Cyrus, who is the king, he's been conquering all the Babylonian Empire except for one portion of it, which was the city of Babylon. And remember, Babylon was a great and fortified city. It was understood that Babylon itself, if it was besieged, could, and if one of the ways that armies attacked in that time was to surround the city and cut off every lifeline from it. So that way you would either just starve to death, you would run out of provisions, you would start eating each other and killing whatever, right? It understood that Babylon was so great, especially because of where it was located, because of the walls that it had and the fortification it had. I mean, the walls I think were like 80-something feet wide, thick, right? And I don't remember how long they were. But not only that, they had a river flowing through it. So they could grow crops, they could do everything, they had water. I mean, they could sustain themselves, it was thought, if they ever were besieged, for at least up to 20 years. right? So if an army was surrounding them and attacking them, for 20 years, they could hold off and just live, right? I mean, that's longer than any of you guys have been alive. 20 years. And so this is what's happening at this point. Babylon is under siege. And the chapter here in chapter 5 is going to describe the final downfall of the Babylonian Empire. So verse 1, Belshazzar, the king, he made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords. So understanding what I just told you, that they're under attack, that they're under siege, that every other part of Babylon has been conquered, what do you think you should do? Throw a party? Try not to think about it?
What else would you do? Fight back?
Yeah. I mean, I would, I guess. Is that a good king? No. No, it's not. Not only that, but obviously we see who he's providing this for, 1,000 of his lords, and then we see it, encompasses his wives and concubines. It's not a very good king, not a very smart king. Not a king who is spirit-led. Not a king who is surrendered to God and led by the Holy Spirit to make wise decisions. So Belshazzar, the king, remember Daniel's Babylonian name was Belteshazzar, so we shouldn't get the two confused. So he makes a great feast, a great feast. The outer wall, so I actually have the notes here, of the city was 350 feet tall and about 90 feet thick. And the river that was running through it was the river Euphrates, which ran through the center of the city from north to south through the great brass gates. And the city was so large that it had its own internal farms. With the water from the river Euphrates, it was thought that Babylon could survive a siege of 20 years. So, again, what is Belshazzar doing making a feast when he's under siege, when he's under attack? I think there's a couple things. One, he's a bad king, obviously. But I think he's ignorant in sin. Because we've talked about this before, that when we are in sin, we are the dumbest we could be. And I'm not talking about like knowledge, I'm not talking about like book smarts, I'm really talking like common sense. We lose it, we get dulled, our senses, our understanding, our wisdom, our discernment, all these things, our judgment on things become so desensitized and dull to the point where we can't rightfully judge things. This is what sin does. It makes you absolutely stupid. And I think because of the sin that he's in, it has made him stupid or foolish or ignorant. And I think on top of that, he's also arrogant. We see this with his grandfather, right? Nebuchadnezzar. He's prideful. I think he's showing to the world, or trying to show the world, that, hey, we're invincible. You cannot touch us. But we're going to see that that's going to be the opposite. Some parties don't turn out the way that we intend them to. There was a wealthy businessman. He hosted a spectacular party in which he filled his swimming pool with sharks, barracuda, and other assorted dangerous fish. He announced to his guests that he would like to challenge any of them to try swimming across the pool, and he would offer a first prize of either a new home in the mountains, a trip around the world for 2, or a piece of his business. No sooner than he had made the announcement than there was a splash, and a man swam rapidly across the infested waters and bounded up out on the other side. The millionaire said to the dripping man, "That was a stunning performance. What prize do you want?" And he answered, he said, "Right now, I don't really care about the prize. I just want to know the name of the guy who pushed me in." And then after that, I would probably thank him because I made it across. Sometimes you just don't know how it's going to end. And I think, again, when we are caught in sin, when we are living in darkness, we can't see rightly, right? We think, I'm untouchable. Nothing's going to stop me. But Belshazzar is going to find out pretty quickly that the Lord's going to intervene. It says in verse 2, while he tasted the wine. And I think this is going to be a common thing, and this is something we're going to touch on pretty extensively tonight. And bear with me, this is why we're only going through 5 verses tonight. There's a common theme in verses 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay? A common theme. Really in verses 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's wine. right? Now, sin makes you stupid. And I also believe wine, alcohol, however you want to define it, also can make you stupid in almost the same exact way. So he's drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000 in verse 1. And then while he tasted the wine in verse 2, he gives a command, and not a very good command. He says, bring the gold and the silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 1 had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Do you think that's a smart thing to do? Do you think it's a smart thing to ever disrespect and not revere a holy and perfect God? No. And I think there's a fine balance of where we don't think this thing is holy, right? This item is holy. Because ultimately, listen, the only thing that truly has a definition of holiness is God himself, right? So we don't want to go to the extreme of some religions where they call this holy water, or this is a holy, blank, fill in the blank, right? Because that thing in and of itself is not holy. But I do think that there's certain standards and there's certain things that we need to be mindful of to revere God first and foremost, right? When we look at the Old Testament and some of the things that the priests had to do and some of the restrictions, it wasn't so much because of the tabernacle that thing was holy. It's because God is holy and God instituted it. It was God's design. It was his plan. And really there was, more to it. There was instructions to it, but ultimately God is holy. So they dishonor God. They dishonor God by taking the things that were meant to represent holiness, meant to represent a reverence to God, and they use it in a disgusting way, right? To throw this party and to drink with his wives and his concubines, to get drunk, to put wine in them, right? There are things, and the most important things, which is us. Remember how many of you guys went to our retreat this past fall? What was our theme? Vessel for honor. Is that what does that symbolize? Is that, the fancy pitcher that you have in your kitchen, your china that your mom has? You have china? No, it's us. We know that. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 20 to 21. But in a great house, there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, and some for honor, and some for dishonor. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful for the master, prepared for every good work. We, because we've been transformed and cleansed from the inside out because of the grace of God, are now vessels of honor. And we should be mindful of that, right? We should be honoring the Lord in that and being sanctified in that. You have things in your house that are meant for honor, right? Maybe not to you, but maybe your parents. They have certain things that, your parents are probably like, you can't touch this. And you really want to touch it, but you can't touch it. And then you have other vessels that are, for dishonor, like your toilet. I don't know. Actually, I love my toilet. Without that, it'd be horrible. But look at the theme. Verse 1, he drinks wine in the presence of the 1,000. Verse 2, he tastes wine. Right? He gives it this command to dishonor the Lord. Verse 3, then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines did what? They drank wine from them. Verse 4, they drank wine, and what do? They praise the gods of who? Gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Wood and stone. Daniel is going to eventually come on the scene, and he's going to tell him, these gods know nothing. Do you know why they know nothing? Because they are nothing. They're nothing. Yet here they are in their drunken stupor, praising a God who does not exist. And here's the vast difference between us and them. They are praising gods who don't exist for things that their God can give them. Right? Like, hey, like silver and gold, would they continue to praise that same God if there was no silver and gold given to them? I don't know. But for you and I, why do I praise God? It's not necessarily because of what he gives me, but it's because of who he is. Now, that's not to say that there isn't things that he gives me. Like, we see that all throughout the Psalms. But ultimately, in the Psalms, the praise is unto God for who he is. Right? He's deserving of it because of who he is, his character, his nature, and everything that is beheld by him. But because of who he is, there are certain things that I get, but the things that I get aren't the things of this world. Right? I mean, there might be times where he blesses you with things of this world, but ultimately, that's we could do with or without, and he would still be deserving of my praise. But ultimately, he gives me things that are outside what the world can offer. The grace and the freedom and the peace and all these things. But ultimately, praise him because of who he is and not ultimately what he can provide us. And so the question begs is, would they praise their gods if they had none of these things? Probably not. And yet here they are bestowing praise and honor unto something that's not even real. But again, the commonality that we see in verse 1, 2, 3, and 4 is wine, is alcohol. I want to read really quick, well, not really quick, we're going to take a minute going through this. The negative effects of alcohol. Now, I am teaching a bunch of kids where it is illegal, not based upon the Bible, but by the laws set by our nation, in our state, in our city, that you cannot drink alcohol at your age. Correct? Do you guys know this? Okay. Even if your parents give you permission, it is still illegal. Until what age? 21. Good job. Now, let me say this. I'm gonna come from the standpoint. I'm not going to try and define what is sin or not sin. Okay, I'm gonna tread very carefully. But I will come from the standpoint, as someone who doesn't drink and has never tasted alcohol, and that's not because of any of my great doing. I think God has just given that to me and I've been blessed by it. So I come from that standpoint. Okay? I want to pitch the question to you. What good does it provide? And then let's talk about what bad things can it provide. Right? Because we know a lot of bad things. Right? A lot of bad things. And then the question is this. What good things that can alcohol provide that God can't without alcohol? Does that make sense? Like, do we have to live a life where I need it, I want it, and let's say it's not sin, right? I need it and I want it because of this, but can't God provide that without alcohol? Can't he provide, because I don't know what people come up with. It makes things more enjoyable or lively or this or that. I don't know. Whatever they want to come up with. I'm not here to judge or say that's right or wrong, but I want to challenge. Can things still be lovely and enjoyable and lively and whatnot, even without alcohol? Can God provide that? I don't know. I think he can. But let me read this from Solomon himself in Proverbs. He talks about this when it comes to alcohol, and he talks about it a lot. It says, who has woe, in Proverbs, you can write this down, Proverbs 23, verses 29 through 35. He says in verse 29, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaints? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who linger long at the wine, those who go in search of mixed wine. Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, and when it swirls around smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent, and it stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your heart will utter perverse things. Yes, you will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, or like one who lies at the top of the mast, saying, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beaten me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake that I may seek another drink? If that wasn't very clear on the negative effects that all alcohol imposes upon man, I don't see a single good effect. So whether one lingers long over wine, right, which he says here, becomes drunk, or simply goes in search of it to taste wine, meaning maybe just drinking without becoming drunk, there are negative effects of alcohol consumption. And Solomon lists 6 of these effects in verse 29. First he says, who has woe? W-O-E. This is, an indication of lamenting or an emotional distress. And the ironic thing with alcohol, and we're talking about alcohol specifically, this doesn't mean like we're adding other things to this, we're talking about alcohol specifically, is that the way that some people deal with emotional distress is alcohol. But then what does alcohol provide? Emotional distress. So then what do I use to deal with emotional distress? Might turn to gambling, which also then I will turn to alcohol, which brings emotional distress. Do you guys see what's happening here? Like, it's just what you try. Eli, can you turn the TVs off? What we try to, I don't know, what we try to cover up ultimately hurts us and makes us want to cover up again with the same thing that hurts us. And alcohol does not fix anything. It only helps us to ignore the problem temporarily and often makes the problem worse. Rather than turning to alcohol during these times, what should we do? Because God can always provide something better or greater than anything this world can offer. So if we are desiring the help from emotional distress or something that has caused us harm and lamentation, well, what does 1 Peter 5:7 say? Cast all your cares upon who? God, Jesus. Why? Because he cares for you. He'll help you. Well, the second question is, well, who has sorrow? And this word translated sorrow is from a word that suggests want. It indicates that one comes to be in need. So Solomon warns that the use of alcohol can lead to poverty. Proverbs 23:21. For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty. There was a study that was done, and I tried to confirm it. It said, and I believe this to be true, it indicates that the average beer drinker, so someone who drinks beer, this doesn't include us, in the United States spends about $1,200 a year on beer. And I think the average person is probably within the couple $100s, right? So some people, and again, this isn't universal. It's not like everyone who drinks alcohol is out there spending thousands of dollars. But again, here's the thing. Alcohol can lead to these things, right? But if you never touch it, can it lead to it? No. If you never go down the path of destruction, can you ever go to destruction? No. I mean, that makes sense, right? But God has called us as Christians to be good stewards of our finances, right? To be good stewards of our finances. Proverbs 3:9, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase. So he says, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Then he says, who has contentions? This is a social issue here. So first we were talking about emotional and financial. Now it's social. This is about discord. Solomon says that wine is a mocker, a strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. Proverbs 20, verse 1. It can cause people to be argumentative, violent, and you may or may not have seen this in your own lives. Maybe with family members, friends. But what does God expect for us as Christians? Or to be peaceable, right? He says, like, you, as much as depends on you, to live peaceably with all men, right? Alcohol does not allow for that. Well, the next question he brings up in Proverbs is, who has complaints? Or the KJV might say babbling. This refers to our inability to communicate effectively, right? If you haven't experienced this firsthand with someone close to you, you obviously, Hollywood can portray it. They obviously know what it looks like and what it provides. That people cannot communicate effectively. The wise man, Solomon, also says that the alcohol will cause your heart to utter perverse things. Proverbs 23, verse 33. It removes the filter from our speech. Whereas Titus tells us as Christians, we should have sound speech that cannot be condemned. So alcohol can lead to these things that are contrary to the Christian lifestyle. It prevents us from guarding our speech as we should. The next question that we see in Proverbs is, who has wounds without cause? We see the mental aspect, the mental strife and destruction of alcohol. Who has wounds without cause? I have many wounds because of cause, right? I dove for a baseball and softball. Now I got scraped up knees. Well, who has wounds without cause, right? Proverbs 23, verse 35, going back to that section, it says, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beaten me, but I did not feel it. Alcohol can desensitize. It can dull. Again, these are things that are very similar to just being in sin in general. A desensitization. It affects the memory, right? That the fact that you can't realize that when you were getting hurt, that you are hurt. That you can't remember things, that you can't feel things. That it damages your minds, it damages your ability to serve God. And then there's a physical aspect of this. The last question that Solomon raises is, who has redness of eyes? Alcohol affects your physical state and your condition. It affects your physical state and your condition. Paul tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 6:19 through 20, he says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were bought at a price, therefore glorify God in your body and your spirit, which are God's. So hear me out again, because you may have parents that drink, and I'm not here to condemn them. I'm not here to judge them. I'm not here to say, I don't want you to go home and be like, hey, Jeffrey told me you're in sin because you just took a sip of alcohol. I think the Bible is pretty clear that every one of us would agree that to get drunk is positively sin, right? There's no question about that. And I think there could be an argument to be made that beyond drunkenness, that it may not be sin. But Paul brings up the most wonderful question when it comes to it, when he says, all things may be lawful for me. Yeah, maybe I have the freedom. Maybe it hasn't led me into sin. Maybe it hasn't led me into all these negative effects yet. But he begs the question that, yes, it may be lawful for you, but is it helpful? Is it helpful? What good can it bring? I mean, think about it. Like, what are things in your life outside of alcohol? What things in your life would you want to pour your time and possessions and everything, your finance and all that, into if it doesn't provide anything good? Like video games. Yeah, Jack, you have a problem. You need to stop gambling. Guys, can we pray for Jack? Now that gambling's legal in North Carolina, it's an issue. So, again, I mean, like, there's certain things, like the older you get specifically, I don't want to waste my time on things that don't provide something. Like, I want to learn, right? I want to grow in understanding. I want to grow in skill and gifting. I don't want to just do something if it doesn't provide anything. Let's say it's not bad. I'm not trying to say video games are bad. But again, what good is it providing? Besides maybe like a waste of time. But again, do you really want to waste your time? Because you only have so much. Think about that. Here's the dangers of alcohol. I'm going to go through this quickly because I think we're running out of time. So in addition to the negative effects of alcohol that we just talked about, we need to consider the dangers that Solomon warns about. One, alcohol endangers your life, right? He says, they've struck me, they've beaten me, I wasn't hurt, and I didn't feel it. Well, you become less aware of your surroundings. I mean, the world even understands this because there's laws put into effect that you can't drink and drive, right? And do you know I don't know the statistics, so don't take my word for this. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that alcohol is probably in like the top 5 of statistics when it comes to deaths. Is it number 3? So somewhere up there, it's high, right? Alcohol-related deaths. Doesn't that speak to something? You become less aware, vulnerable to dangerous situations, accidents, things that could be easily avoided. For what? What is the good that you're looking for in it? Again, can't God provide that without it? Consuming alcohol recklessly can put your life and others in danger. You become oblivious to things. Alcohol is also addictive. What was the last sentence in Proverbs 23? When shall I awake is the question. I will seek another drink. After all of those negative effects, Solomon is like, to the one who is controlled by alcohol, the next thing that he wants is alcohol. You become enslaved to it and addicted to it. But who, as Christians, are we enslaved to? A good master, Jesus, right? Who doesn't have any negative effects. There is no overconsumption of Jesus. There is no financial issues with Jesus. Like, if I want more of Jesus, it doesn't cost me anything, right? I'm not going to be, stuck financially. I want to be enslaved to Jesus, who is a good master and treats me well and provides good things. Alcohol can also allow you to forget the law. In Proverbs 31, verses 4 through 5, it's not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, not for princes intoxicating drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the justice of all the afflicted. I think in one sense you forget the law, but you also don't care about the law, which is why people drink and drive, because there's a stupidity and an ignorance to it. And I think that goes against what God has for us as Christians, that we are to abide by the law. And ultimately we're to abide by God's law. I don't want to be caught not doing that because I'm addicted to this. Alcohol mocks the user of it. Proverbs 21, I said this earlier. Wine is a mocker, a strong drink a brawler, and whoever is intoxicated by it is not wise. Many who drink still think that they're in control. And it's the same thing with sin. When we're in sin, we still think we're in control. We still think that I'm not going to allow it to go further than I would ever think I would allow it. But what ends up happening is that you continue to over justify and allow one thing to lead to another, and at some point you are where you are. I mean, the person who is in a state of a drunken stupor and homeless or whatever state they're in because of alcohol, didn't just get there overnight, right? It's a slow allowing of this thing to lead your life and to control you and be your master. It mocks the user. I mean, look at Noah. Remember Noah? Right after a whole year of being on a boat where God killed everyone justly. And he saves Noah and his family. I think it was like 8 people. What does he do? He gets drunk. He gets naked. Shame is brought upon him. His sons walk in on him. He's humiliated. That's what alcohol does. Help me be a little more mature, guys. A little bit. Just a tiny bit. So for the Christian then, what's the answer to this? Is it okay to drink if we don't get drunk? Now let me throw this at you. Again, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will challenge you with questions so that you come up with your conviction. Okay? Because the best thing is to have your conviction for something rather than, I'm not going to do this because so-and-so said it. Unless Jesus said it, then that's a good reason, right? We are called to be sober-minded. And that's not just in a physical sense of being intoxicated because of wine or drugs or any other hallucination, but sober-minded in the sense of just having a clear mind. And here's the reason: because we have an adversary, right? You have an enemy. It's not your friend from school or your so-called friend. It's not this guy, it's not that girl. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, right? It's Satan. And so Peter tells us, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So as a Christian, you should be sober-minded. Well, what should we be filled with as a Christian? The Spirit of God, right? Ephesians 5:18, do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. Not only that, but we as Christians, we're to leave our old lives of sin behind. Now, I hope you at this age are not leaving that behind, because legally you shouldn't have tasted of it yet. But in the state of a sinner, I leave the sinfulness behind, right? 1 Peter 4:3, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. We leave those things behind because now we have a new master and we follow him. And again, this is the last point, is that we are not to be mastered by anything. Paul says, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. That encompasses alcohol or anything else that can control your lives. And I'll say this is not to be legalistic. And you may not understand what legalism means. It's not a word that you find in the Bible, but it's something that we as Christians have come up with. It describes a doctrinal position emphasizing a system of rules or regulations for achieving both salvation and spiritual growth. I'll tell you right now, I'm not standing up here because I've never tasted alcohol. I'm not being legalistic in the sense of I think that I'm better than another person or more holy or have a greater position in God's kingdom based on another Christian who does drink alcohol and doesn't get drunk. That's not what I'm saying, right? But I am warning a bunch of teenagers of what the negative effects of alcohol can do and maybe will do if you allow it in your lives. And I'll ask you this question. What is the reason for you later on in life? Think about this when you get to that age, because I've had many of friends, when they turn 21, it's the first thing they wanted to do. And my question is, why? Like, what is it? What is the draw? Is it because you don't want to feel like an outcast because everyone else has done it? I don't know. What is it? Why? So it's not a legalistic stance. I don't think that we are better, but I have a greater master, right? I've been instructed to follow him and to be consumed by him and nothing else. And so I want to encourage you guys with that tonight, because again, as we see through these first 4 verses, that I think ultimately his stupidity was not surrendering and recognizing a holy and perfect God. Because Daniel's going to come on the scene when he talks to Belshazzar, and he says, even though you knew these things about God, yet you still rejected him. Even though you knew the stories of your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar and what God did for him, yet you still rejected him. That was where he went wrong. And then he added alcohol to it, and it got worse, right? That is the first and most important thing, is that not that I try to abstain from alcohol, but that I abide in Christ. And I think there are fruits that come from it that allow me to not go down certain paths, which I think some has to do with alcohol.